What divides humanity? Many things, of course. But in this video, we will attempt to reduce this division down to one dimension, the ability to tolerate uncertainty. As with all forms of reduction, in our attempt to do so, we will lose access to some nuance in the full spectrum of the color palette. But we will proceed anyway, with the purpose in mind, to derive an analytical framework that can provide us with utility in almost any circumstance. With the limitations of this tool always in mind, we can readily deploy it in any situation and ask ourselves, does the person we are speaking with, or the theory or concepts that we are dealing with, do they tolerate uncertainty, or is it intolerant, demanding the 100% certitude of the unassailable hermetic closed loop? To some degree, this is a question as old as time, and the ability to tolerate uncertainty, or to even calculate in one's head a probabilistic landscape of potential outcomes and likelihoods, is something that has surely divided humanity for millennia. From this distinction, perhaps, we can even find the outlines of humanity's oldest and most pervasive structures, Mosca's law, and the distinction between the rulers and the ruled, the elites and the masses, the governors and the governed, those who are mere victims of fate versus those who shape it, or in the heroic traditions, those who calculate to some degree what fate awaits them, but after having done so, choose to march forward regardless. Water always flows downhill spontaneously, but across a disordered and chaotic landscape, this axiom has limited utility. But if one has the mind to carefully carve irrigation channels in the landscape at strategic points, utility can be derived, and the fate of that trickling water can be corralled, controlled, and utilized for decades to come. The cognitive landscape of a society, nation-state, or supranational population, in many ways, is no different than the topography of an agrarian landscape. The elite ruling class of any society, those who control the reins of institutions, wealth, power, culture, and information, have, we could surmise, long understood this similarity. The unpredictability of managing the masses, the disorganized, discollective horde, can be made more predictable by engineering cognitive grooves into the landscape. Channels, grooves, troughs, and low-lying depressions can collect the masses into predefined cognitive funnels that can then be directed in such a way that the edifices of power remain a safe distance away from these torrential flows. Oftentimes, or even always, these torrential flows can and will be redirected at the enemies of power and to erode their spindly edifices before they grow too strong. For just as with water, it is a shame to let its flow go to waste. To escape the erosive and corrosive flow that comes from a critical mass of mass cognitive coalescence, the cognitive landscape of the masses, its distribution of sentiments and tendencies, must be understood and exploited by the powerful. But despite metaphysical claims of a collective cognitive coalescence of the masses being possible, Marx's utopian end state, when grounded in reality, from our experiences, observations, and from the data that we can collect, more clearly we can see that such a mass coalescence is most likely impossible. But certain metaphysically derived ideologies and their fantasies and fairy tales will forever be dangled by the powerful or those seeking power over the heads of the gullible, as usual, for the purpose of attaining, gaining, and preserving power for themselves in the endless spiral of elite circulation that Vilfredo Pareto ultimately derived from his painstaking analysis over a century ago. In this video, we will explore the classification of theories laid out by Vilfredo Pareto in his 1916 book, The Mind and Society. This book is an enormous 4-volume publication that goes through painstaking derivation, but we will draw on some key aspects and use it here for our analysis. In writing the book, Pareto attempted to build a scientific or logico-experimental framework for the study of sociology, one that escapes dogma and the necessity of articles of faith. For our analysis, we will focus on the cognitive and ideological landscape of a society and how it is shaped by such theories. This, ultimately, ties into Pareto's classification of residues that he goes on to derive in The Mind and Society. Residues, in Pareto's analysis, are the manifestation of human sentiments and human instincts, which form the basis of our non-logical behavior. Although some portion of human behavior is logical, done intentionally with a particular goal in mind, most of it is non-logical. Some examples of residues include pity, religiosity, conformity, self-sacrifice, the sense of injustice, ritualistic behavior, and the preference for combinations, synthesizing or combining things to make new things, versus the persistence of aggregates, or the tendency to resist change and maintain the status quo and traditions. These residue classes are not found in equal measure in all people, with this being evident from the diversity of character within any human population. Shown here are the 6 main residue classes, but I will just briefly allude to them in this video. Further, from these residues, which are non-logical, humans seek to construct post hoc rationalizations for their non-logical actions in the form of derivations, or in more common parlance, ideologies. This is done for the purpose of trying to make things make sense. These derivations result in a range of ideologies, belief systems, moral codes, and cultural norms that we can find in any human society at any given time. If we posit that the elite ruling class plays a significant role in building and formalizing the prevailing ideology, the legal system, and that it generally polices cultural and moral codes of conduct, we can see how this forms a sort of ideological superstructure that sits atop the cognitive or residue landscape of the masses that they govern. The prevailing ideology of any time must suitably match or resonate with the distribution of sentiments, instincts, and residues that exist within the human population at any given time. Generally, human sentiments are very persistent and they change very slowly over time. As such, this represents a limitation of social engineering. The ability of certain narratives, ideologies, and governing principles to resonate with these residues or psychological tendencies of the masses forms the basis for Mosca's political formula, or the principle of sovereignty that gives the ruling class its legitimacy and justifies their hold on power. If the ideological preference of the elite ruling class is mismatched to the sentiments of the populace, it can result in instability. In our modern period, for example, we can note that the delocalized post-national ruling class and the ideology that they push, neoliberalism, deracination, and disdain for the nation-state, is currently at odds with much of the populations that they govern and has given rise to the recent populist movements in both the US and in Europe. In a previous video, I elaborated on this further, but effectively, the Western ruling class at present is dominated by Class 1 elites, or the foxes in Machiavelli's terms, whereas most of the populace is still dominated by the persistence of aggregates, the desire to conserve their culture and their identity. As such, attempts to dissolve the nation-state and its borders, both in the physical sense and in the abstract sense, leads to tensions and instability. But for this video, we will merely keep in mind Pareto's classification of residues and the fact that these residues exist as a distribution within any human society. In the back of our mind, also, we can imagine how this distribution of residues may itself be a sort of engineered distribution, one that has resulted from centuries of incentives or punishments, carrots and sticks, perhaps are the means by which the distribution is kept suitably aligned, both with respect to social stability and with respect to elite interests. Why are so few people curious, we can wonder, perhaps because many of the curious people over the centuries have been weeded out of the population. Curiosity killed the cat. This distribution of residues you can think of as the inherent ideological preferences or cognitive tendencies that exist within any society. They are important for maintaining social stability and equilibrium. From this, we can surmise that any ideology that exists or circulates within a society will be better matched or more strongly resonant with different elements of the population. Other portions of the population, in contrast, will resist the prevailing ideology and will be viewed as dissidents. For many people, those who live unexamined lives, they most likely just go along to get along. As this video will be about the tolerance of uncertainty and the differences between the metaphysical and the scientific, with that distinction being a means by which the ideological derivations that dominate a society at any given point in time are justified, we can begin to see how this all ties together. Here, I would argue, the preference for 100% certainty within much of the populace gives rise to the power of metaphysical theories, which are ultimately used by the ruling class for the purpose of either driving utility or marching their populace onward towards whatever goals they set for themselves and the societies that they govern. The portion of the populace that are most favorable towards metaphysical theories, the ones derived from deductive logical structures that guarantee 100% certainty, then give the ruling class profound utility, as, I would argue, the validity of the a priori assertions that form the capstone of any metaphysical theory are themselves imbued with life and an animating spirit by the ruling class themselves. This forms a sort of hermetic enclosure or a tether between the elite ruling class and the portions of the population that are most susceptible to metaphysical theories and those that require 100% certainty for stable psychological functioning. I'm not a trained philosopher, and we will periodically extend into the thorny and nearly impenetrable field of philosophy, but we will attempt to bushwhack through the philosophical undergrowth as best as we can for the purpose of exploring the ideological landscape and the utility that the elite ruling class derives from shaping and controlling it. This analysis will be imperfect, but we'll do it anyway. Conceptually, we can think of the ideological landscape as a superstructure that sits upon the cognitive landscape of the masses or the humans present within a given society. Pareto writes that, without disparagement of any of those estimable sociologies, we here venture to expound a sociology that is purely experimental, after the fashion of chemistry, physics, and other such sciences. In all that follows, therefore, we intend to take only experience and observation as our guide. When we say that a thing is attested by experience, the reader must add "and by observation." When we speak of experimental sciences, the reader must supply the adjective observational, and so on. Here we can clarify that what Pareto means by experience is in the context of scientific reasoning and the scientific method, objective and reproducible, observational, and experimental data. And this does not include the subjective internal feelings or metaphysical lived experience that receive so much attention in our postmodern world. We can also note the challenges with applying the scientific method to sociology and human affairs. What is viewed as objective to some is subjective to others and vice versa. But still, it is possible to clinically and objectively reduce many human phenomenon down to things resembling some kind of standardized analytical unit. And this is what Pareto does for much of his analysis. He does this by drawing on vast amounts of historical data, as well as the various mythologies, fairy tales, and stories that, with a fairly high degree of commonality, all humans share with one another to some degree. Here we can think of the many commonalities that exist between religions, something that often becomes very obvious when viewed under the lens of comparative religious study. In order to take into account all possible combinations of theories that can arise, Pareto splits theories into two classifications. Class 1 refers to experimental matters, and Class 2 refers to non-experimental matters. For Pareto, non-experimental matters are the realm of metaphysics, those that transcend experience and are abstractly derived from non-falsifiable first principles. These non-experimental matters will often invoke the essence of a thing, include appeal to sentiment, or rely upon abstractly derived principles. For the Class 1 theories of experimental matters, if the nexus, or the means by which the links and connections are made in the reasoning chain, are logical, then Class 1 theories can be called logico-experimental, aka the process of scientific reasoning. For experimental matters that have a non-logical nexus, for example, those that use sloppy pseudological reasoning or are constructed via appeals to sentiment, or with non-logical, long-jumping leaps, those theories are classified as non-logico-experimental, or non-scientific, despite dealing with experimental matters. We could call this pseudoscience, or the slop of scientism. Class 2 theories of non-experimental matters, those based on metaphysical assertions, are also non-logico-experimental. If the reasoning present within the theory is conducted and constructed logically, these theories can be generally classified under the umbrella of metaphysics, and follow in the long and rigorous tradition of metaphysical philosophical theories. If the Class 2 theory, involving experimental matters, is devoid of any logic, bouncing around from sentiment to sentiment in bounding leaps, in our modern parlance, we can simply refer to them as slop. From Pareto, metaphysicists generally give the name of science to the knowledge of essences of things, to knowledge of principles. If we accept that definition for the moment, it would follow that this work would be in no way scientific. Not only do we refrain from dealing with essences and principles, we do not even know the meaning of those terms. Now, of course, in our communications and interactions with one another, very few people manage to stay purely in the logico-experimental realm. It is an ideal to be pursued, but if we were to do so at all times, doing or saying anything would become overly burdensome. And in reality, almost all theories or arguments will have some blending between the types, and will contain both experimental and non-experimental elements, as well as logical and non-logical reasoning. But the presumed fact that some people view the logico-experimental as an ideal stands in sharp contrast with many who don't, or even disdain the scientific or logico-experimental approach. Or, perhaps, even more alarmingly, is the growing push from the establishment towards scientism, adopting the form of science with appeals to scientific language and the authority of the priestly scientific class, without maintaining the rigors of science, the logico-experimental methodology, falsifiability, and the epistemic humility that is necessary for quote-unquote real science. A statement such as "I am the science" is an example of such trends, as well as an over-reliance on the scientific consensus. Science is constant debate and dissent, for science is bounded by inductive reasoning. In other words, science is never proven, but merely it moves gradually, more closely approximating reality over time. And as Noam Chomsky tells us, consensus can be manufactured. That is not to say that consensus isn't valuable or that it can't indicate strong convergence with reality, just that when consensus is appealed to in a dogmatic fashion, alarm bells should go off. But ultimately, when it comes down to careful academic work and high-level intellectual discussions, perhaps, we should at least do our best to target this logical experimental ideal, even though we know that we will constantly or always miss the mark. Trying and missing, perhaps, is better than throwing it out the window entirely. Already, maybe, one can begin to note the profound significance of what Pareto lays out in his classification of theories with respect to the many contentious debates related to human nature, politics, religion, and ideology. For some, those who pursue, or at least attempt to pursue, the ideal of the scientific process and the logical experimental, relying on data, evidence, and observations, they may quickly run into a brick wall when they encounter someone of the metaphysical orientation. To the scientist, speaking at length about the essence of a thing is meaningless, merely a subjective, ever-shifting notion invoked in the mind of its subject, and something that will endlessly evade the lasso of the scientist who seeks to categorize things precisely and rigorously. For the metaphysically minded people, maybe, unable to even fathom the cognitive machinery needed to evaluate things scientifically, they receive the endless gratification of evading capture by cleverly twisting words, taking advantage of this inherent lack of linguistic precision to maintain their worldview and their demand for 100% certitude in their beliefs. Here, we can briefly enter one of the most basic levels of philosophy and logic, deductive versus inductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning moves from a general principle or premise to a specific conclusion. In deductive reasoning, a premise may be granted a priori, with the a priori premise being independent from objective experience, data, or observations. For a deductive structure derived from the a priori, if the a priori premise is true, then the conclusion that results from the deductive reasoning that follows is guaranteed to be true with 100% certitude. It can be thought of as a top-down form of reasoning. Deductive reasoning is also found and used in the scientific process, but with scientific forms of deductive reasoning, the principles or premises themselves, the theory of gravity, for example, are themselves arrived at by inductive means and are based on facts rather than metaphysical a priori claims. In contrast, inductive reasoning is bottom-up. It begins with facts, observation, evidence, and data. Inductive reasoning is the only means by which to generate new knowledge. In technical terms, it is ampliative, whereas deductive reasoning is non-ampliative. From the facts that can be gleaned from base reality, inferences are made that lead to probable conclusions, though they are never guaranteed with 100% certainty. This forms the backbone of scientific reasoning and the scientific method. Theories can be arrived at, but they are never accepted to be 100% true. Merely, they are the most probable explanations and are based on the presently available facts and data. If more data is found or contradictory evidence is attained, the scientific inductively based process is flexible and can dynamically rearrange itself in order to accommodate the new facts, data, or experimental evidence. Early philosophers, maybe, because of the strict theological superstructures that dominated the past, generally disdained inductive reasoning because inductive reasoning does not lead to 100% certainty and guarantees. Here already, we can see the preference that some may have for 100% certainty and the inability to tolerate uncertainty. Also, we can note that the early practitioners of science often found themselves in grave danger. If it was theologically ordained and reasoned to 100% certainty that the sun revolves around the earth, collecting data and pursuing an inductive scientific reasoning process that suggests that the earth actually revolves around the sun can be tricky business. In other words, the 100% certitudes that are guaranteed by deductive reasoning when their principles and premises are flimsy come under threat when they are held up to the lens of facts, evidence, and inductive logic. When the human power structures, whether secular or religious, are the ones guaranteeing the validity of the a priori principles or premises, a bunch of scientifically minded people running around and poking holes in their premises is an attack on their authority itself. In our modern period, J. Bhattacharya is an example of this. As such, inductive reasoning and the scientific method have a profoundly democratizing effect on knowledge and truth, something, of course, that the power centers have always found odious. David Hume's critique of inductive reasoning and the scientific method, that causality is always unproven and that inductive reasoning is therefore illogical, was somewhat resolved in the post-Humean period, but the underlying division remains. The epistemic humility of the scientific method in the inductive process, the acceptance that nothing is ever known to be 100%, is merely the cost of attaining new knowledge. Or at the very least, absolute truths may exist somewhere and somehow, but it is beyond the bounds of the human mind to ever achieve this 100% level of certainty or to make this truth claim. Further, scientific theories, when done correctly, are themselves testable and falsifiable, unlike metaphysical theories. And scientific theories can better stay grounded to base reality rather than to cognitive linguistic flights of fancy. Karl Popper bypassed the problem of induction by reframing its pursuit of knowledge. Rather than proving theories, the scientific method sets out to disprove theories. In effect, the scientific method is analogous to a sculptor. You remove the pieces of the stone that don't correspond to reality and are found to be false, leaving behind only the most probable, most predictive, and most reliable base that most accurately reflects the sculptor's subject, reality itself. The sculptor will never reach a perfect facsimile. It will never deliver 100% verisimilitude or fidelity, but that is the price the sculptor pays for sculpting. Alternatively, he could sit alongside the campfire, staring at his navel, imagining the perfect sculpture, but only in his imagination will he ever reach this pinnacle of perfection. And from there too, maybe, he could even construct an ivory tower from which to reside and survey his imagined domain of perfect fidelity. In a real-world example of this, those who require 100% certainty, even if it is a flimsy certitude, can be found self-gratifying themselves in comment sections, learning to type the phrase, correlation doesn't equal causation, or dismissing things without the apparent ability to explain their reasoning or logic. If their belief system is governed by the non-verifiable a priori assertion, and if their logical structures are purely deductive, they can live inside this sealed palace indefinitely. Data, evidence, or analytically derived counterclaims simply bounce off the glass with 100% certainty. Or sometimes they simply tell you to read a certain book or to read the literature. That by itself isn't necessarily a bad thing, but if they are unable to explain anything from this book or elaborate on its contents, then perhaps A, the book is not useful, for the reader claims to have found value from this book, but wasn't even able to themselves output anything to suggest that the book even contained anything of value. Or B, the person merely has come to grant the book some kind of metaphysical power, perhaps attaching their identity to whatever the presumed contents of the book are, the presumed contents that they can't even manage to explain in detail or with rigor. If we think back to our younger days, maybe, we can even recall a time when we did this. Some book was cool for some elusive reason, and pointing to a certain book implied that the coolness of the book would be transferred to you by virtue of pointing at it. As far as those who say to read the literature, please tell what literature specifically you're referring to, rather than merely pointing in the direction of some undefined authoritative source. Or even better yet, provide some kind of brief summary as to why whatever this document allegedly contains is relevant to whatever matter prompted the imperative that this document should be read in the first place. If you want people to be convinced of your ideological point of view, you have to do some work rather than merely pointing at things. This by itself is merely the age-old appeal to authority fallacy, and is an admission that the person pointing at the thing, rather than demonstrating any ability to elaborate on why they believe the particular thing, is merely appealing to authority, and is pointing in the direction of some authoritative body, or better yet, a manufactured consensus under the influence of big business dollars. This connects us to the topic at hand. Those who require 100% certitude and who receive their 100% certainty solely via spindly tether to some authoritative source, typically one that is part of the elite superstructure. In other words, they have outsourced their cognitive function, and although they may be a loyal adherent to whatever authority they are tethering themselves to, they will fail to successfully recruit more people to their cause if the potential new recruits don't readily accept or resonate with whatever the base assertion is. In fact, if they do it poorly enough, they will just alienate people. Maybe we can remember back to 4th or 5th grade when the teacher told students, put it in your own words, and realize that many people didn't bother to take this advice. When people make an appeal to some book, whether it be the Bible, the divine word of the spiritual creator, or Marx, with his words viewed as equally divine by those that seek to project and collapse the Christian utopian afterlife onto the physical plane, after the metaphysically vague resolution of all contradictions comes to pass, the underlying mechanism is the same. In some book, somewhere, lies the answer, the kernel of unfalsifiable truth, and the path to hermetically sealed 100% certainty. This is also the same trick employed by shady influencers selling their overpriced courses and multi-level marketing schemes. By using this comparison, I don't mean to criticize or diminish Christianity, because Christianity, something that is readily admitted by most of its practitioners, is a religion. It is a faith. It is a spiritual matter that admittedly transcends our mortal earthly coil and forms a bridge to the transcendent realm of the divine. Disproving such a claim is beyond the bounds of science. Marxism, in contrast, masquerades as a materialistic prescription, an atheistic substitution product that is in no way atheistic due to its reliance on faith. Not a faith in God, but in Marx himself, a way to run economies and society for the purpose of delivering the utopia on earth. But despite the fact that the utopia never seems to come, Marx's followers, nevertheless, remain undaunted because Marxism is based on a metaphysical a priori assertion. It is inevitable that a truly classless system, one devoid of oppression, exploitation, hierarchy, and oligarchy will come, emphasis on the word inevitable. Just as the Christians believe, as an article of faith, that Christ the Savior will inevitably return to earth, so too do the Marxists believe that the post-class utopia will inevitably be made manifest. Just like the Christians, the Marxists also view their end state as inevitable and with 100% certainty. Science concerns itself with data and evidence, mechanisms and processes. By what process will the Marxist utopian end state come? By what process will the contradictions be resolved? And how will this perfect historical end state be reached? Marx lays out a vague, allegedly logical process to describe how this occurs, but it is very hand-wavy and not very convincing when viewed in light of history, data, evidence, and the limitations of human nature. It would work better if he had included a more agentic deus ex machina, a benevolent AI coming to manage society, or aliens remapping human nature to make us more like ants than like human beings. But instead, he simply relies on the metaphysical deus ex machina of the resolution of all contradictions. The Christians place their faith in God to achieve their end state, and God, after all, is God and works in mysterious ways. For the Marxists, they just place their faith in the words of a mortal man who claim to not be peddling a neo-religion. Religions contain the possibility of the deus ex machina, a non-human agent emerging to solve the intractable problem, but Marxism lacks this. In past versions of the experiment, it seems, this process mostly involved the elimination of human contradictions that don't adequately have, or at least don't sufficiently pretend to have, an adequate amount of faith in Marx and his inevitability. The Christian societies of old did this as well. Christ won't return until we rid ourselves of all the sinners and wrong believers. Marx's end state isn't totally impossible. Perhaps something approximating Marx's end state could be delivered by a benevolent AI system after the value of human labor goes to zero, or if aliens come and reprogram human nature. But in our real-world system, it's much more likely to manifest the likes of the World Economic Forum and Tony Blair-style technocrats than one where the proletariat seizes the means of production and manages it as the mythical, stateless, non-hierarchical collective. Also, good luck, the capitalists already outsourced the means of production to China, and what work remains will be performed increasingly by automated means across the globe. The terminal drive to substitute capital for labor marches steadily onward. But for the Marxists, undaunted, they will merely see this as evidence that the utopia is coming because China claims to be a socialist, Marxist, communist country. Very seldom will Marxists even attempt to explain the process that Marx alludes to. Instead, they will just tell you to read Marx. Or as it seems to me in some instances, Marxism just relies on the metaphysical power of the word and the label. Stick the name Marxist or communist on China's state-controlled hypercapitalism and it becomes Marxist because the power is in the metaphysical essence of the word. Working 15-hour days, 6 days a week in a factory that needs to have safety nets installed around the roof while assembling smartphones for rich Westerners for very little pay. Well, you see, that is not exploitation or oppression because it is a Marxist factory. And of course, by attaching the Marxist label, it imbues the factory with the essence of anti-exploitation and anti-oppression, like some kind of supernatural force field. In other words, pure postmodern word magic. Plus, if the Chinese ruling elite, a rigid and all-powerful oligarchy, say they are working in the best interest of the people, we can ignore the popularity of Italian supercars amongst the Chinese elite and all the elite money that is stashed in overseas bank accounts, and simply believe their claim. After all, they say they are Marxists, and definitionally, Marxists are against exploitation, so we should just believe their assertion, and by doing so, we retain a requirement for 100% certitude. If we check the data and the logical experimental process, we find that wealth inequality in communist China is virtually the same as in the US. In the US, the wealthiest top 10% hold 70% of the total wealth. In China, the top 10% hold 68%. America has the most billionaires in the world, with China following closely behind in second place. Even when it comes to luxury items, what would have been considered the pinnacle of capitalist decadence in the much more purely Marx-aligned Soviet Union, we find that the U.S. is the #1 market for Bentleys, with China once again following closely behind in second place. And that is to say nothing of the booming market for luxury handbags, watches, and jewelry, many of which may cost many times more than a typical Chinese factory worker assembling circuit boards somewhere in a socialism with Chinese characteristics factory would make in a single year or even a decade. To insist that such an economic system is still Marxist or communist, in light of the data, the facts, if you will, would be an absurd claim. But for the true believer, those who believe that the essence of Marxism is all that matters, simply attaching the name is all that really matters. It is the spirit of Marxism, after all. The Chinese political ruling class, those who hold the reins of power, claim that they are working in the best interest of the Chinese people. And despite the fact that all the ruling classes across history have claimed to be working in the interest of their people, the fact that the Chinese ruling class does so under a red banner neutralizes facts and reality, allowing for the a priori assertion of Marxism to live on, free of cognitive dissonance. As a metaphysical theory, we can surmise the essence is all that matters. Now, that says nothing about the effectiveness of the Chinese system as an economic model. It has materially improved the lives of the Chinese people, but it has done so by adopting a form of state-controlled hypercapitalism and by discarding any economic system that would have resembled anything that Marx would have had in mind when he wrote the Communist Manifesto. Or we can take the dictatorship of the proletariat, another concept that is not tethered to reality, but rather animated by the metaphysical essence of Marxism. Managing complex systems requires hierarchy to function, and an oligarchical ruling class will inevitably emerge from the complexity. Michel's iron law of oligarchy, and simply adding the suffix of the proletariat, something imbued with Marxian metaphysics, doesn't cancel out the fact that a dictatorship implies that it is in fact an elite-ruled oligarchical structure. In Marx's bounding logical leaps, once abundance is achieved, class would disappear. But how is abundance achieved? Abundance is achieved only after a hyper-complex economic system is built, one that leads to abundance, and a hyper-complex economic system will also be hyper-oligarchical as a matter of necessity. The disorganized masses could never take on and manage such a hyper-complex system without the existence of an organizational elite. Just saying it will go away because, well, it just will, does not really follow logically. Why exactly does achieving abundance get rid of class? Who knows? But it is said to be inevitable after all. Does class result because of the variation in the human parameter set? Intelligence, ruthlessness, organizational prowess, and Machiavellian tendencies? No, Marx merely asserts that class is simply a bourgeois construct and that class will disappear once abundance is achieved. But this conclusion or logical leap is not based on data or history or evidence. It is merely asserted. Again, here we find another non-falsifiable a priori assertion. You either accept this assertion or you do not. And the idea that a dictatorship of the proletariat could even be handed off to be ruled by the disorganized masses is equally absurd. Some would still have more skills or valuable skills or greater abilities. Who would do what, and how and why would it all be equal? How would hierarchy be avoided? And most importantly, how would it simply not result in a power vacuum that wouldn't immediately be filled in once again by a new oligarchical ruling group that could seize control? Well, the answer to those questions lies beyond the impenetrable barrier of the metaphysical transition, the resolution of all contradictions, don't you see? From each according to his own, to each according to his needs, is a nice sentiment, but mechanistically, it does a lot of heavy lifting. Or to others, it just doesn't correspond to base reality. Or more practically, with respect to elite interests, it just seems to be a clever way to rationalize away the problem of oligarchy in a system that is definitionally defined as being anti-oligarchical. In effect, all systems are Marxist if they call themselves Marxist. It is a closed loop and it is hermetic. What matters is that Marxism is imbued with the essence of Marxism, the essence of anti-oligarchy and anti-exploitation. 2 + 2 = 5 if we define it as such, and it works so long as the person accepts the assertion. Under duress and under threat of coercion, perhaps, they can more easily be convinced to accept this assertion. On other occasions, as it relates to Marxism, we encounter the no true Scotsman fallacy. Marxism hasn't failed because true Marxism hasn't been tried, you see. In effect, this is equally hermetic. If the metaphysical believer believes that Marxism will 100% lead to the post-class utopian end state, then if such a system existed and it did not achieve the end state, definitionally, it was not Marxist because it didn't achieve the post-class utopian end state. Or for people more predisposed to the logical experimental, we quickly notice that this reasoning is circular. Another variation of this, which I encountered recently, manages to become even more hermetic and seems to purely rely on the label of Marxism, the word as essence, the word as an animating spirit. We could effectively call this the all-true Scotsman fallacy, as it more or less claims that any variation of the Marxist experiment, the Soviet Union, Tito's Yugoslavia, democratic socialism, European welfare states, the much more constrained and reasonable small-scale efforts of the libertarian socialists, and even China's modern form of state-controlled hypercapitalism, are all valid forms of Marxism. Why? Well, despite the many ideological contradictions that we find within these systems that all claim to be Marxist, the factor that unites them all is simply the label, the name, the word. They fly under the flag of Marxism, or one of its many derivative forms. By including the label of Marxism, communism, socialism, or the People's Republic of somewhere, the label imbues the system onto which it is plastered with the animating spirit, the essence of Marxism, and thus they are all equally valid ways to pursue Marx's utopian end state. Maybe Starbucks can learn this lesson. If they change their green capitalist Starbucks lady to a red Starbucks lady and say that Starbucks is now a Marxist Starbucks, perhaps all of their baristas will stop striking and give up the goal of forming unions. If the Starbucks logo is red and is imbued with the metaphysical essence of Marxism, perhaps they will at once cease to labor under the oppressive and exploitive regime of the green capitalist Starbucks lady. The essence of the green Starbucks lady was capitalist and thus exploitative, whereas the red Starbucks lady, if she wears the Marxist lapel, will exude the essence of anti-exploitation. In a similar vein, if the U.S. switched its flag to a red motif and called itself the People's Republic of the United States, and labeled its governing ideology as socialism with American characteristics, all of the oppression and exploitation contained within the U.S. would suddenly vanish and a hermetic force field would descend, imbuing the country with the Marxian essence of anti-exploitation and anti-oppression. Is it contradictory? That's fine as well, because Marx said something about all the contradictions being resolved prior to the utopia materializing, so the presence of contradictions is merely evidence of the process working. Do you pay $5 a month of your hard-earned money to multimillionaire socialist influencers who skillfully use the capitalist infrastructure to enrich themselves, while also hijacking and feeding off your susceptibility to Marxist-imbued rhetoric for the purpose of extracting your $5 a month? That's just revolutionary, man, co-opting the capitalist infrastructure to bring about the resolution of all contradictions by extracting $5 a month from the proletariat. Once all of the contradictions are resolved by necessity, so too will your contradiction of paying $5 a month to multimillionaire socialists. That's fine as well. It's the spirit, the essence, that ultimately matters. In effect, Marxism just becomes some kind of vague intention or a rhetorical claim made by its elite ruling class. An animated spirit that is animated by uttering the magic words. This is the problem with metaphysics. You can reason around in circles all day to preserve whatever a priori capstone is asserted at the top of your reasoning pyramid, rather than simply admitting that it is a faith-based belief system. Or in other words, Marxists will behave in almost the exact same way that Christians do. Read the Bible, they say, or read Marx. The answer is there. Although Christians generally provide a much more logically coherent rationale for their beliefs, assuming you accept their a priori premises, understand that it is faith-based, and are happy to explain it to you at length. In other words, Christians are much better activists for their faith than modern-day socialists are for theirs. Christians are also much less likely to employ angry typing, with angry typing perhaps being itself some sort of Marxian essence that arises when someone has embraced Marxism. Angry typing, maybe, is the modern embodiment of the spirit of continuous revolution. If we return to Pareto's classification of theories, where can we even place Marxism? It seems untethered from historical facts, evidence, or reality, and it relies on Marx's a priori assertion that the utopian end state will inevitably come, but its nexus seems to be non-logical, jumping from sentiment to sentiment, from rage to resentment, and eventually, somehow, via the deus ex machina of the resolution of all contradictions, it jumps over the finish line and returns back to its a priori assumption. The classless, post-hierarchical, post-oligarchical utopia is inevitable. This will happen after the collective masses rise up and seize the means of production, etc., etc. Okay. Per Pareto's classification scheme, maybe, this isn't even a religion or proper metaphysics. It relies on the faith of circular non-logic. Perhaps it's best classified in the slop category. Class 2, non-experimental matters with a non-logical nexus. But what I don't deny is that it is a strong political formula for bringing about a revolution, because it promises the impossible while feeding off the anger and resentment of the masses, frustrated because exploitation, oppression, and oligarchy have and will most likely always continue to exist. And as Pareto's elite circulation theory suggests, from the revolution, reliably, a new oligarchical ruling class would replace the old one. or at least it has every single time Marxism has been tried. And once that new ruling class is installed, because the contradictions will never be resolved, they can set about on the endless task of resolving them, until perhaps there are only but a few people left standing. So, as some often say perhaps, in its most fundamental form, it is just merely a death cult, one fueled by people throwing themselves and others against the jagged rocks of reality. From Pareto's classification of residues, what Marxism really may be is an ideological resonance function, one that taps into human rage, anger, and resentment. Some people have more than me and I'm angry. If I take what they have, I will have the thing that I covet. Or alternatively, we can destroy everything and then no one will have anything, thereby achieving equity. Whereas the Christians will tell you, thou shalt not covet, thou shalt go about your life as best as possible, and thou shalt get on with your day. The Christian teachings address this fundamental human frustration in other ways, through acceptance, forgiveness, and transcendence, whereas Marxism endlessly exploits human rage, anger, and resentment, and packages its followers into neat little groups of people that can be readily exploited by powerful human interest groups for the purpose of sowing division, bringing destruction, receiving $5 a month subscription fees, or for the purpose of installing them and their friends into the next elite ruling class after they conduct the revolution. And there's additional utility. Once the revolution occurs, the schismatic nature of Marxism can then be activated and exploited. First, there are Marxists and non-Marxists, then some variation of good or correct Marxists versus bad or incorrect Marxists, and on down the purity spiral we go until only the most ruthless remain, crystallized within a new oligarchical ruling class. Maybe this was the true dark genius of Marx. He created an ideology that has exceptionally high utility for the powerful or those seeking power. From Pareto's elite circulation theory, find me one human system in history that didn't have hierarchy, oligarchy, a ruling class, exploitation, or oppression. Well, Marxist revisionist history has you covered there as well because, you see, before capitalism came along, we all lived in peace and collective harmony. Drawing from Rousseau's equally fantastical and metaphysical assertion, the noble savage, we were all equal, shared things, coexisted, and worked together for the good of the collective, until Eve partook of the forbidden fruit. Until the capitalist was made manifest. There is anthropological research that indicates that present-day primitive, simple societies based on highly egalitarian structures are actually exceedingly violent. But that is just capitalist propaganda, so we can safely discard that evidence as well. The failures of Marxism can always be explained away, merely just more evidence of capitalist meddling. The religion-shaped hole will always exist in mankind, but at least we can hope that it will be filled by something that is at least self-aware enough to admit that it is a religion, a faith-based belief system rather than something masquerading as a science. In this excerpt from Pareto, we can ask ourselves, how does Marxism really differ from faith-based religious belief systems on a fundamental level? If John, an unbeliever, denies that God created heaven and earth, and you meet with him the authority of the Bible, you have made a nice round hole in the water, for he will deny the authority of the Bible and your argument will crumble. To replace the authority of the Bible with the authority of your Christian experience is a childish makeshift, for John will reply that his own experience inclines him not in the least to agree with you. And if you retort that his experience is not Christian, you will have reasoned in a neat circle, for it is certain that if it is only the Christian experience which leads to your results, one may conclude, without fear of contradiction, that the Christian experience leads to results such as yours, and by that we have learned exactly nothing. In this same passage, we could just as easily substitute Marxism in place of Christianity to achieve the same effect. If John the unbeliever denies that Marx's post-class, post-hierarchical utopian end state will inevitably arrive on Earth, and you meet him with the authority of the Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital, you have made a nice round hole in the water, for he will deny the authority of the Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital, and your argument will crumble. To replace the authority of the Communist Manifesto with the authority of your Marxist experience is a childish makeshift, for John will reply that his own experience inclines him not in the least to agree with you. If you retort that his experience is not Marxist, you will have reasoned in a neat circle, for it is certain that if it is only the Marxist experience which leads to your results, one may conclude without fear of contradiction that Marxist experiences lead to results such as yours, and by that we have learned exactly nothing. This is the fundamental problem with metaphysical theories and belief systems. It depends entirely on the person accepting the base assertion of the theory or belief system, whether it be of the biblical variety or from Marx's Red Book. You either accept it or you don't. It also leads us back to the proposition that the fundamental division within humanity is the tolerance of uncertainty itself. Metaphysical theories may grant their believers 100% certainty, but they will be irreconcilable with other metaphysical factions that carry their own separate a priori assertions and their own separate irreconcilable 100% certitudes. This is one of the most fundamental base mechanisms that leads to human conflict, war, and chaos. The scientific method and the logical experimental theories, in contrast, form their own parallel system. Flexible and adapting to base reality, they make no claims of infallibility, and they make no claims of 100% certainty, only the much less metaphysically enticing promises of probability, reliability, and reproducibility. Concepts that maybe elude many people and exist somewhere outside the bounds of their cognitive capacity. We can, however, stop and notice that metaphysical theories are very useful for the powerful. When the power structures animate any metaphysical theory, imbue its non-verifiable assertions with life, their followers, those who demand 100% certainty, become bound and captivated within its deductive structures, moving under its spell in the direction of any non-believers, seek and destroy. This is the meme from Richard Dawkins. From this hermetic structure, the powerful derive endless utility, and in a certain way, the blind masses too gain utility, dragging forward their genetic material and their proclivities for dogmatically bound doctrines further into the future, the wheel that forever remains unbroken. Some people require 100% certainty to function. Having to rely on the most probable explanation or a much more complicated, statistically based understanding of reality is scary or even impossible for many people. For minds that can't comprehend cause and effect, nonetheless complex system dynamics, they merely require a simple yes or no answer. No nuance or ambiguity is tolerated, or in extreme cases, 100% certainty is required by necessity in order for their fragile worldviews to not collapse entirely. For those of us who are inductively minded, we can roll with the punches. Our worldview is dynamic and always waiting to be updated and refined. It becomes resilient and anti-fragile. We accept that we can never know anything 100%. Our vision of the world extends as cones of probability, a path or explanations that we can only view as more or less likely. For many, this is hell itself, but for others, it is the path to, or at least the pursuit of enlightenment. Ultimately, I would say, this division within humanity is one of our most fundamental, and we could surmise, for the powerful, they stand to more greatly benefit by providing the portions of the masses that require 100% certainty with just that. Simple, 100% certain narratives and explanations. From this, they can use the masses as their cudgel. Pareto eventually derives his classification of residues, a map of the sentiments of people, and from this distribution of residue classes within a society, a social equilibrium is maintained. For society, its most stable and essential element is perhaps the conformist mass. Go along to get along, don't look too deeply into things, and accept the dogma and move on. Don't wake the sleepwalkers because they can be both unpredictable and dangerous. Who knows what shaky premises and deductive chains they will hop to next. The curious and inductively minded have always been problematic for power, but within democratic systems, despite their imperfection and illusory nature, we are allowed to live and exist, so far mostly free of the risk of imprisonment for violating some kind of thought police dogma. Hopefully, in an increasingly AI and algorithmically dominated world, we will be granted some protective silo somewhere, safely distanced from those who need 100% certitude, lest we disrupt their certainty. A technocratic solution for what is perhaps humanity's greatest dividing line. In its most extreme form, intolerance of uncertainty is best served by and placated by rigid ideological dogma, a set of principles laid down by an authority which are defined as inherently and inconvertibly true. For those with the inability to tolerate uncertainty, the hermetic 100% certitude of ideological dogma grants them a sense of calm. In the entropy theory of anxiety, they can rest assured that the world is all in order and no piece is out of place. But outside the tautological boundaries of their closed-loop cognitive chamber, beyond the walls creep the shadows of elite interests, human authorities, those who breathe the very life into the a priori assertions that form the hermetic boundaries of the dogmatic enclosure, and there they work to pursue their own interests, and from these strictures of dogma they derive the highest forms of utility, wealth, power, and the control of those who dwell inside their construction. If perhaps we recognize or accept that many people, perhaps the majority, do not tolerate uncertainty, we can even begin to see how this has shaped and formed human civilization across the eras. Those who are savvy, capable of analytical thought, and can compute a landscape of potential outcomes and options can position themselves most beneficially to peer into the unknowable future and at least stack the deck in their favor. The behavior of any one given individual may be unpredictable, but when bundled as a mass, all moving under the spell of dogma, Predicting the future actions of the mass becomes manageable, or on some occasions, even trivial, while many others, most perhaps, lack this ability and are even confounded by the basic mechanisms of cause and effect, unequipped with the elementary quantitation skills, and are forever plagued by the inability to even make out the hazy outline of the various pieces that make up the clockwork mechanism of complex systems and power dynamics. From this, we can see the utility of dogma, whether from the perspective of the elite ruling class that dispenses and animates the dogmatic spirit, or from the perspective of the masses, blind followers of the metaphysical assertion and the binding effect it has on their mass formation. A thoughtless mob chanting empty slogans, moving as an undulating mass and carefully guided by the strings that tether it to the ruling class, who underwrites and animates its spirit. For those of us who are more predisposed to analytical thinking, data, evidence, and don't require 100% certitude, we were willing to accept or even prefer a more probabilistic worldview underwritten by analytical processes. We may stand around scratching our heads, and we may look on with a twinge of fear and unease at the sight of the formed mass mob, but perhaps we can rest assured that those of our type have always lived this same nightmare for all of human history. The elite ruling class and the mindlessly moving mass, perhaps, is itself a kind of unity, a timeless absolute principle that the metaphysicists write about. But for better or worse, we can stand outside its boundaries, peering in, collecting more data and analyzing, so long as we are not slated for destruction. The fate of the heretic is often grim, but for many, being a heretic is fate-derived and not choice-derived, having been either blessed or cursed with a curiosity, a tolerance of uncertainty, and an analytically framed mind. And if one manages to be a particularly good heretic, history may even remember you, and future generations will cherish you, unlike those blind adherents of the mob, who simply pass down the drain as some kind of continuous, undifferentiated fluid. From Pareto, as regards proofs, a person stating a logical experimental proposition or theory, they ask for observation, experience, and logical inferences from observation and experience. The person asserting a proposition or theory that is non-logical experimental can rely only on the spontaneous assent of other minds and on the more or less logical inferences he can draw from whatever is assented to. At bottom, he is exhorting, urging, or encouraging something rather than proving. In logical experimental theories, principles are nothing but abstract propositions summarizing the traits common to many different facts. The principles depend on the facts, not the facts on the principles. Logical experimental principles are governed by the facts, not the facts by them. They are accepted hypothetically only so long and so far as they are in agreement with the facts, and they are rejected as soon as there is disagreement. In contrast to logical experimental theories, Pareto describes the non-logical experimental. But scattered throughout the non-logical experimental theories, one finds principles that are accepted a priori, independently of experience, dictating to experience. They do not depend upon the facts depend upon them. These a priori principles are accepted without regard to the facts. Facts must of necessity accord with the inferences deducible from the principles, and if they seem to disagree, one argument after another is tried until one is found that successfully reestablishes the accord, which can never under any circumstances fail. We can note here the hermetic enclosure of non-logical experimental theories. They are true endlessly because they are asserted to be true, on in an endless spiral. Or anyway, more cynically, until they are no longer useful for the powerful, and until the metaphysically oriented populace undergoes a new regime of social and ideological re-education. More simply, Pareto states, for the man who lets himself be guided chiefly by sentiment, for the believer that is, there are usually but two classes of theory. There are theories that are true and theories that are false. The terms true and false are left vaguely defined. They are felt rather than explained. From this, Pareto leads us to something that is maybe timeless and still highly operative today, the funnel of narrative control and valence. The good narrative versus the bad narrative, the good person versus the bad person, he elaborates. Oftentimes, three further axioms are present. Axiom 1, that every honest man, every intelligent human being must accept true propositions and reject false ones. The person who fails to do this is either not honest or not rational. Axiom 2, every proposition that is true is also beneficial and vice versa. When accordingly, a theory has been shown to be true, the study of it is complete, and it is useless to inquire whether it be beneficial or detrimental. In Axiom 2, we can see a sort of forced closure. What is deemed to be true must also be beneficial. Thus, anyone denying the truth must also be acting against the public interest, an antisocial personality, or in extreme cases, an enemy of the state or an enemy of the people. Axiom 3. At any rate, it is inadmissible that a theory may be beneficial to a certain class of society and detrimental to others, yet that is an axiom of modern currency, and many people deny it without, however, daring to voice that opinion. The last one is very interesting, and it seeks to block the question. Does this disproportionately serve elite interests at the expense of the masses? Well, maybe. We can cynically assume that will almost always be the case, and perhaps is the point of this axiom. In Axiom 3, also, we can see the outline of Thomas Sowell's unconstrained vision, or as he refers to those who follow and profess this unconstrained vision, the anointed. The anointed, in their pursuit of the unconstrained vision, the pursuit of an idealized utopia, become immune to the accusation that they are serving their own interest. A very clever hermetic trick. Looks like my friends and I stand to make millions off of this, but to accuse us of disproportionately benefiting would be absurd. As the anointed, we are immune from self-interest. Whatever riches may come are merely unintended consequences. How convenient. Pareto goes on. Passions, accords of sentiment, vagueness of terms are of great efficacy in everything that is non-logical experimental. In the sphere of proof, experience is as powerless against faith as faith is against experience, with the result that each is confined to its own domain. However, here we can point out another trick of Marxism. By our measures, Marxism is a faith-based religion waiting for the inevitable utopian end state that was promised by Marx. However, the trick that Marx played was that he blended or domain-shifted Marxism by insisting that it is not a religion, but it is instead a science. So Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, etc. all admit and willingly nest themselves in the religious domain, but Marxism insists that it is not of the religious domain. By doing so, Marxism allows itself to feed off the energy that is typically channeled to a faith-based religion, guaranteeing 100% certainty while tapping into the God-shaped hole in the hearts of men, while also destroying or usurping the gods of the religions that came before it. Why are there very few ancient temples left in mainland China, but there are many, many more in Taiwan? Because, out of necessity, Marxism destroys the old gods and replaces it with the god of Marxism itself. Pareto, at the beginning of his book, states that his framework is not constructed for the purpose of judging one way as better, for better is itself subjective and meaningless, but rather as a means to distinguish. Our aim is to distinguish, not to compare, much less to pass judgment on the relative merits and virtues of those two sorts of thinking. We in no way assert that the logical experimental proof is superior to the other and is to be preferred. But perhaps we can allow ourselves to be less gracious than Pareto, and perhaps note the profound and destructive utility that the powerful can wield when they ensnare the masses with their twisting and subjective metaphysical word games. The masses, many of which are incapable of scientific reasoning, easily falling into elaborate and deranging metaphysical labyrinths that are designed to sow division and channel their energy while protecting the edifices of power from the more objective and democratizing force of the well-crafted logical experimental argument. The non-logical experimental theories in our reasoning will always have their a priori capstone, the vertex of the pyramid, underwritten and animated by the power centers themselves. As long as the a priori assertion is granted power and legitimacy by the powerful, its deductive structure will remain standing and be unassailable against waves of data, evidence, and counterarguments. If we look back at the historic metaphysic philosophies today, we can see many discarded corpses, a priori assertions that were eventually discarded by the powerful once they were no longer useful. History, then, as Pareto says, is a graveyard of aristocracies, but maybe, as well, it is the graveyard of the discarded a priori assertion, part and parcel, one and the same. Any ruling class or aristocracy will animate their own a priori assertion, deriving utility therefrom, until those aristocracies too come to pass, and with them so too will their metaphysical assertions. We can expand here into some real-world examples. In the past, when the West was a feudal system and was ruled under Christian theology, the elite power structures maintained their power and legitimacy by invoking the great chain of being. Derived from Christian theology, the great chain of being was a hierarchical structure of all matter and life, on earth and in heaven. At the top was God, the Creator, and descending beneath him came angels, humans, animals, plants, and then minerals. This is all fine and good, of course, but the great utility for human power came in continuing this hierarchical logic, one granted by God himself, mind you, in classifying humans into a hierarchical system that was also imbued with validity by God himself. At the top of the human hierarchy came the king or queen, then the lords, then the lesser nobles, then the common man. At the level of the common man, the man himself, the head of household, as above so below, was himself the ruler of the household, with the wife being subordinate to the husband, the children being subordinate to the parents, etc. This system was very effective at solidifying and edifying the power structures via the religious metaphysical assertion. The entire pyramid of hierarchical power during this period was itself unassailable, granted unquestionable validity by God himself. A king was above the lords were above the nobles, and the lesser nobles themselves were preserved from challenge from the sea of commoners below them. We don't seek to say that this was good or bad, but we can clearly see that it provided exceptional utility, a hermetically sealed utility, in fact, that was underwritten by Holy Writ. As the West has progressed through the Enlightenment and into our modern era of democracy, we feel that we have progressed from this theologically constrained, unenlightened system and into the scientific age of technocratic rational management. But in reality, we still live under the same system, but merely, superficially, the assertions and sentiments that animate our world today have simply found new forms. But just as in the past, these assertions and a priori capstones are still animated and underwritten by the powerful, by an elite human ruling class who may no longer invoke the Bible or theology, but rather the ever-twisting and ever-shifting metaphysical claims of human rights, humanitarianism, liberalism, or some modified form of neo-Marxism, where class has been replaced with essentialized identity groups. If we do even a slight bit of digging, we can find that this constant refrain of human rights and humanitarianism rings a bit hollow. We can find much evidence to the contrary that these principles are valued at all. Just as with the great chain of being, beneath the lofty appeals to universal values, we can find the crude outline of utility, the ever-present mechanisms of power. The capstone of the West is the liberal democracy, one perhaps that seems to be growing more obviously illiberal and less democratic by the day as the mechanism of information control breaks down. Although, in light of elite theory, Mosca's law, Michel's iron law of oligarchy, and the tether that exists between increasing complexity and increasing oligarchical strength, democracy has always been an illusion. It offers great benefits for the common people, so long as an adequate amount of care is taken to sustain the illusion and to maintain the social contract. That is not meant as a terminal indictment of democracy, but just that for a democratic system to have legitimacy with the masses, who it supposedly represents, quite a bit of work must be done to maintain the illusion, and there must be a sustainable utility that the masses provide to the ruling class for the purpose of maintaining the social contract. When the masses no longer provide utility to the ruling class, the social contract collapses in turn. In reality, all power structures have more or less illusory veneers, covered in some fig leaf or another to obscure the cold metallic vertical of power. Some are more obvious than others. Under any political system, a notion of a social contract always exists. Whether in the old world monarchies, the modern US, Europe, the Soviet Union, or modern China, the leaders always claim or have claimed to be acting in the interest of the people or the nation. Whether this claim is authentically believed by the masses or if the belief is merely achieved via coercion and threat, authentic belief in this likely exists on some continuum and is dependent on any given person in the society. Perhaps, as always, the rulers prefer those who are more inclined to belief, undaunted by facts or logic, the age-old symbiosis of the rulers and the true believers. But the illusion of democracy and the liberty and range of choice that it offers its human inhabitants is certainly better, in my view, than the strictures of hard authoritarianism and the typically much more restrictive dogmas that they use to control and thought police their populace. In an authoritarian system, you know you are not free, but in a democratic system, you are granted an illusion of freedom, a difference of degree, but an important one. But in the present state of the modern West, as less and less work is done to maintain the illusion, we can begin to note some things. One is the meaning of the phrase our democracy, an attack on our democracy, etc. In the past, when the illusion was more well maintained, we could reasonably include ourselves in this R of our democracy. However, today, this becomes less clear. The elite ruling class, or at least the increasingly gormless and faceless men and women in suits that serve as the mouthpiece of our democracy, when they speak of our democracy, perhaps, we begin to wonder if we are included in this. If the populace grows weary and frustrated with the state of their democracy, and they increasingly wish to change the direction of their democracy, definitionally, as ruled by the people, this is perfectly in line with the democratic process. And yet, the repeated mantra, the slogan, an attack on our democracy, perhaps begins to ring a little strange. Whose democracy exactly? Yours or ours? Perhaps we need to consult a Venn diagram of who's included in the R category. Another mantra or slogan that is often imbued with validity from the creator himself is the slogan, often repeated by the power establishment and their surrogates, "Diversity is our strength." Again, we can ask, who is "our"? For the working man, regardless of what color he is, who struggles to exist in an ever-contracting economic system and amidst a backdrop of spiraling inflation, one battered and bruised by decades of outsourcing, automation, financialization, and mass migration, perhaps he can wonder, does flooding the workforce with desperate gray zone foreign labor give me strength? Or does it merely give strength to the entrenched elite interests, big business, and the already hyper-wealthy? Wage arbitrage abroad occurred under the outsourcing regime, and then in the final stages, wage arbitrage comes home as well. Are gray zone economic migrants, the ones that can be described with varying degrees of wordsmithing, illegal or merely the more benign-sounding undocumented, easier to exploit than those of the legal documented variety? Is exploiting gray zone migrants good because it is done in the name of diversity? Does their presence serve the working class, their strength, or does this "our strength" simply refer to the elite ruling class themselves, the hyper-wealthy, and the delocalized corporate superstructure that sits atop our equally complex and delocalized managerial governments? Not to mention the tensions that arise within the populace, the masses, because from this migrant influx, the tensions and frustrations that arise is fertile ground for division, thousands of news articles, millions of hours of podcast discussions, millions or billions of outrage units generated, and with this all serving to distract from the growing economic precarity that we find across the West. Questions indeed, but just like the great chain of being, endowed with its validity by the Creator himself, we are often strongly encouraged to not pursue this line of reasoning. It just is what it is, a metaphysical a priori assertion that when logically analyzed down serves to justify the wishes of the powerful, a simple utility function, one that perhaps most benefits them and not us. If we return to the third axiom that Pareto outlines with respect to what I refer to as narrative control, we can see this as a prime example. Axiom 3. At any rate, it is inadmissible that a theory be beneficial to a certain class of society and detrimental to others, yet that is an axiom of modern currency, and many people deny it without, however, daring to voice that opinion. We can further extend this inquiry to another popular slogan, one often either written on hand-drawn signs or on professionally printed signs funded by shady dark money sources. No human is illegal. It invokes a sort of pleasant sentiment, a sort of heartwarming humanitarian profoundness that one could hear at the side of a campfire while eavesdropping on a conversation held between two less than washed and likely inebriated hippies. Yeah, man, no human is illegal, man. But if we dig deeper here, we can notice a sort of mixing of terms, an intentional blurring, and an almost purposeful imprecision. Whether or not something is legal or illegal is a fairly objective classification in a legal sense. In a world of countries, borders, and laws, a person can certainly be legally or illegally present within the sovereign territory of a nation. But perhaps we can note to ourselves, is the sovereign nation itself the enemy of the post-national, globalized, open society? Don't you want to live in an open society? Maybe, just as much as I want to own nothing and be happy. I, as a citizen of the US, am not a citizen of Japan. If I were to go to Japan under a temporary tourist visa and overstay my visa period, once this time elapsed, my presence in Japan would become illegal. Perhaps the essence of my humanity and personhood on some deeper metaphysical level would not be illegal. This is the hazy, imprecise sentiment that is invoked by the empty phrase, "no human is illegal." But it is not relevant to the question at hand, whether or not I am legally present in Japan once my visa term expires. If a Japanese policeman were to find me and become aware of my now legal presence in Japan, the country that he is sworn to and legally endowed with the powers to preserve the law and order thereof, he could arrest me and arrange my deportation before a judge. When I spoke to the judge, I could say, "Your Honor, son, but no human is illegal," but he would likely find this lesson compelling in his court of law. Later, although I could perhaps hysterically claim that I am thus being kidnapped by Japanese jackbooted thugs who are interpreting illegal in the objective legal framework of laws rather than my metaphysically derived terms of human essence, which is metaphysically never illegal, I would beclown myself to do so. The only difference is, at present, the Japanese ruling class doesn't adequately benefit enough from my no longer legally present self running about Japan. Maybe they don't have enough sweatshops for me to work in, and perhaps there are less billionaires who own migrant hotels that could receive lucrative government contracts to house me, and this metaphysical invocation would have limited standing on the sovereign territory of Japan. although perhaps as the creeping delocalized neoliberal cloud further extends itself over the globe, maybe, Japan is too heading in this direction. In the direction of the metaphysical tyranny of the nonsensical and irrelevant assertion, one that when imbued with power by the ruling class, seals itself off hermetically from any logical or evidence-based challenge. In Japan, being a country like any other, will surely be filled with countless ranks of metaphysically minded humans, the proverbial hippies around the campfire, ready to be enraptured by this empty phrase, no human is illegal. Once their elite power structures, too, having fell under the spell of neoliberalism, pump it full of life and animate its spirit. Pareto wrote a similar passage when discussing the nature of objective versus subjective phenomenon and the idea that thoughts somehow supersede objective reality. Here we can find some similarity with our Japanese visa example from above. It may be that a sheet of paper with engravings on it and a genuine banknote of the Bank of England are both mere thoughts of the mind, but if you dine at a London restaurant and try to pay your bill with the first of those thoughts, the engraved paper rather than the genuine banknote issued by the Bank of England, you will soon notice that just as one thought is of another born, that thought will present you with a whole litter of offspring. First, the thought of the policeman, which, whether objectively real or not, will hail you before the thought of a judge, who will introduce you to the thought of a well-barred jail cell, where you will meet a thought that the English call hard labor, and which, according to all reports, is not the pleasantest thought in the world. And all that will convince you that the two sheets of paper certainly belong to two sharply different categories, since they give rise to different facts, or differing thoughts, if you prefer. Here, Pareto tells us that word games and thought games, the forerunners of postmodernist nonsense, are nothing new, and although one can terminally view everything as subjectively abstract, my truth is as good as your truth, our truths will inevitably collide with the hard surface of objective reality in some way. At best, we can try to position ourselves on the side that is most consistent with reality, the is and not the metaphysical and idealistic ought, for reality is as reality does. It cares little for subjective thought games or circular logic, but subjective word games are like some kind of black magic trick for many, a means to weasel their way out of any linguistic trap or to be held under a spell. But physical world traps, the sharp and unforgiving teeth of a steel trap or the taut coil of a snare, care little for words and cannot be reasoned with. In the palace of the mind, maybe, metaphysicists reign supreme, but in the cold light of reality, the logical experimentalists find solutions, for they embrace reality, or at least closely and as approximately embrace reality as is possible. Pareto elaborates, metaphysicists enjoy a certain a priori certitude, for their super-experimental criterion is of such majesty and power that it dominates the experimental criterion, which must of necessity accord with it. For a similar reason, theologians too are certain a priori that the two criteria never fail to accord. We, much more humble, enjoy no such a priori enlightenment. We have no knowledge whatever of what must or ought to be. We are looking strictly for what is. Here too, in this discussion of the is versus the ought dichotomy, we can refer back to Thomas Sowell's framework of the constrained vision versus the unconstrained vision. The constrained vision centers itself on what is. There are no ideals, only trade-offs. Self-interest is innate and human nature is unchanging. In contrast, the anointed of the unconstrained vision advocate for the ought, what they think should be, that man is morally perfectible, a blank slate to be shaped and molded by an elite superstructure manned by the anointed elite, that perfection is possible and compromise unnecessary, and that the anointed themselves, in pursuit of these noble goals of the ought, become themselves immune from self-interest in the pursuit of this idealized state. Pareto goes on to distinguish between synthetic and analytical processes. The human mind is synthetic, and only training in the habit of scientific thinking enables a few individuals to distinguish the parts in a whole by an analytical process. Note in the above passage, synthetic refers to a holistic process of understanding things as a whole or as a unity, rather than by deconstructing it to its individual components. Whereas in contrast, an analytical process involves deconstructing the whole or unity into its constituent parts in a systematic fashion. This next quote, I think, is quite profound, and it grants us a useful analytical instrument when assessing a situation where a discussion of ideas, concepts, and theories are present. Some people often experience an insurmountable difficulty in considering the different aspects of a thing separately, one by one. To be convinced of that, one has only to read a newspaper article before a social gathering, and then try to discuss one at a time the various aspects under which it may be considered, one will notice that one's listeners do not follow, that they persist in considering all aspects of the subject altogether at one time. The significance of this above passage, that many people, and maybe even most people, cannot consider the different aspects of an issue separately, is profoundly impactful if we wish to understand the mind and society. It is a central and recurring point that Pareto encounters in his pursuit of a logical, experimental, scientific study of sociology. For those of us who are more analytically minded, we run into this problem frequently, but perhaps we don't understand its root cause. Debating with people who are of the holistic, metaphysical variety will almost always go in a very predictable direction. Deconstructing a system, issue, or problem via the analytical approach and making appeals based on data or experimental evidence will fail to penetrate the metaphysically and holistically oriented mind. The reasoning is top-down. There exists an a priori assertion, one that is generally non-verifiable, non-falsifiable, and based on sentiment, or some kind of metaphysically derived essence. Their a priori assertions are viewed as absolute principles or absolute truths, whether issued from the power structure, the approved narrative in our common parlance, or derived from philosophical introspection, from theological dogma, or merely from sloppy navel-gazing. The absoluteness and non-verifiability is what grants them the power of their certitude. If any logic is present in their thought process, everything will be derived downward via inductive means, with their a priori assertion representing the vertex of the reasoning pyramid. All subsequent steps downward, insofar as they may be logical, from the absolute principles to the concrete case, will be sealed within a hermetic closed loop. Their conclusion will be reached with 100% certitude, so long as their capstone, the a priori assertion at the vertex of their argument, is viewed as sound. Their minds will stay sealed off from reasonable discussion. This is the limitation of discourse. At best, we can agree to disagree. If the a priori assertion is challenged, perhaps expect hysterics, rage, or angry typing. Don't wake a sleepwalker, for it can be dangerous when transitioning from the dream world, one unbounded by facts, and back to the world of reality. Too rapid a transition can be too much to handle. Pareto continues with respect to absolute principles in the concrete cases of reality. While metaphysics proceeds from absolute principles to concrete cases, experimental science proceeds from concrete cases and not to absolute principles, which, so far as it is concerned, do not exist, but rather to general principles, which are brought under principles still more general, and so on indefinitely. That procedure is not readily grasped by minds accustomed to metaphysical thinking, and it gives rise to not a few erroneous interpretations. Here, we can note the fundamental difference between absolute principles and general principles. Absolute principles are assumed and accepted independent of data or experience, and they are viewed as unassailable, certain, universally true, and timeless. We can also point out, as an extension of this, that absolute truths are also unverifiable and unfalsifiable, a status that places them in complete opposition to the scientific process. In the scientific process, or the logical experimental process as described by Pareto, scientific theories and general principles are never absolutely true, but rather they are generally true, with scientific theories being best fit approximations based upon our current understanding and based upon the currently available data, and further limited by the constraints of time. The fact that the Earth revolves around the sun is a general principle, not an absolute principle. For billions of years ago, there existed no Earth and no sun around which to revolve, and billions of years into the future, this will once again become true. Further, it is possible that an infinite number of versions of the Earth, revolving around an infinite number of suns, exist somewhere in an unseen subdimension of reality, but we can never know this with 100% certainty. Claims of absolute truth or absolute principles somewhat inherently stake their truth claim beyond the constraints of time. The scientific process, then, is never absolute, but rather it is fluid, dynamic, and the validity of its claims are claims based upon probability, predictability, and reliability, rather than in absolute certitude. Over time, the scientific process will begin to more closely approximate the quote-unquote truth, but it will never reach this horizon, nor does it claim that it ever will. In short, absolute principles, from the confines of their hermetic wrapper, claim 100% absolute and timeless certainty, whereas the scientific process, from its humble and probabilistically derived boundary conditions, never makes 100% certainty claims, but rather claims that are most likely to be probable, predictable, and reliable. For scientific claims, if new data or evidence comes to light that contradicts its working hypotheses, the field of logical experimental science reconfigures itself in a dynamic fashion in order to accommodate new data and evidence. Old hypotheses die and new ones are reborn, or if they aren't rejected entirely, they may be merely restricted to a certain domain, like classical and quantum mechanics. The absolute principles derived from hermetic a priori reasoning, in contrast, will fail to do this. Locked within its crystalline palace and with its deductive logical structures deriving 100% certitude, its capstone, the non-verifiable a priori assertion, the vertex of its pyramid, can never be challenged. Or more practically and realistically, this is the case, so long as the cultural zeitgeist and elite power structures do not seek to dismantle the absolute certainty of their current a priori claim that sits atop their metaphysical superstructure. In practical real-world terms, the validity of any a priori assertion will in fact be underwritten by the power establishment and the elite groups that govern a society at a given time. It can never be assailed or uninstalled via the scientific process, new data, or scientifically framed arguments, so long as the a priori assertion continues to be granted its unassailable validity by the elite power structures themselves. Pragmatically then, using a utility framework, we can see that the a priori assertion that is underwritten by the elite power structures is likely to be underwritten for the utility that it provides to the ruling class. Whether for the purpose of social control, wealth extraction, or the more benign competitive advantage, it is the elite ruling class and the power structure itself that breathes life into the non-verifiable a priori assertion. In other words, to use metaphysical terms, the animating spirit of any non-verifiable a priori assertion is the elite ruling class itself. This profound utility, one derived from the closed loop of hermeticism, is a dark art. And with a fairly high degree of probability, we can assume this trick has always been operative within human systems. The scientific process and the logico-experimental, in contrast, can be viewed as a democratizing process. If something is derived logically from data, observation, and done with scientific rigor, its insights can be discovered or built by any human with a command of the scientific process. It enables its practitioners to skirt the hermetic boundaries of the crystalline palace and derive their own worldviews outside the reach of the human power structures. To sum up this already very long video, I think one of the most fundamental issues that divides humanity is the tolerance of uncertainty, or in most cases, the intolerance of any ideology, worldview, or framework that does not guarantee a 100% certitude, the forced closure, a hermetic seal, the need to feel that everything is in order, the low anxiety of the low entropy state of mind, and perhaps this has always driven human societies and civilizations. From Pareto, the resonance between metaphysical theories, the a priori assumption, animated and given life by whatever ruling class holds power and the substrate of the masses. And from the distribution of residues, perhaps, this ideological message has always been tailored for the conformist mass, or to say it more kindly, those high in the class 4 residues of sociability. The need for a strong, stable community, one with shared values and united under some commonly understood framework of goals and beliefs, is essential for human flourishing and societal stability. Although, as with everything, it will be abused and used by the powerful, they always find their utility. But there is still value in such things at the level of the individual and the community. So in many ways, we can't judge the system or cast aspersions at all. And there we arrive at a sort of entwinement or paradox. Human societies need the metaphysical theory, but the theories of metaphysics themselves will most likely doom humanity and lead us to our destruction. From the clash of metaphysical conflicts, as unresolved as their a priori assertions are unfalsifiable, they will surely lead to many conflicts and wars in the future, just as they have in the past. In a similar vein, so too is science likely to doom humanity, whether it be from malevolent AI, nuclear weapons, or some Frankenstein virus. So as many of my videos seem to conclude, maybe, we are left with once again the Amish. Perhaps the Amish have already figured out the most optimal solution for humanity, but I doubt many will listen. Although maybe, science contains not only the elements of humanity's destruction, but it also contains the probabilistic scientific field of risk management, something that if managed by a neutral or benevolent AI, could at least be used to make humanity's destruction less likely. An AI that, probably, would find our susceptibility to metaphysical conflict to be inefficient and illogical. If it were to decide to destroy us, it would use metaphysical magic and its capacity for superhuman complexity and speed to swirl us into a maddening whirlpool and drown us once and for all. If metaphysics is ultimately a bunch of fish swimming in circles within a barrel, the AI would have the power to churn us into a homogeneous paste of water and fish particles before flushing us down the drain. Or if it wanted to save us, it would engineer and architect a means to save us from this metaphysical tyranny. Metaphysics, instead, only offers us the barrel, the water, and a place for us fish to swim endlessly in circles. As we have been slowly removed from our ancestral environment, the plains, forests, or mountainsides of the hunter and gatherers, coerced and replanted in the agrarian period, moved into dirty, cramped cities in the industrial era, and finally in our modern era, fully atomized into individual economic units with everything commoditized, we have increasingly been made into fungible tokens, our interests and desires both cultivated by a digital matrix, and with the information and products we consume increasingly delivered to us through the same digital matrix. Our removal from anything resembling our ancestral environment is disappearing fast. We ourselves have begun to be sealed into a hermetic enclosure, one with room for only 1, 2, or maybe 10. What can you do about it? Perhaps if you're lucky to be intellectually oriented, you can seek comfort and satisfaction in ideas, theories, and philosophies. If you embrace the logico-experimental, really, this whole thing is quite fascinating. As it always has been, the world is a laboratory, and in our modern world, there are both literal and figurative microscopes and sophisticated instruments by which we can see and examine far more than any human that has come before us could. So far at present, the information system seems to tolerate a fairly high degree of free discussion. Certainly, if we are realistic, perhaps, more than at any time in human history. For now, at least, heretics are no longer being burned at the stake or being set upon by mindless, metaphysically animated mobs. For others, or all of us for that matter, it may be best to reconnect with religion or with time-tested traditions. For the traditions, of course, it will only be a simulacra and a sort of divorce from time and place nostalgia. A nostalgia for something that you never experienced yourself and will never experience, for it is dead and gone. There are no longer any great unifying beliefs that bind us to our communities or nation states. Their borders and boundaries, both physically and metaphorically, have been dissolved, or at best have been perforated into a leaky sieve. The free transfer of information, its volumetric flow, and the speed at which it moves, now travels at the speed of light through undersea fiber optic cables, round around the world 1,000 times over. You can try to reestablish community, or reconnect with whatever spiritual tradition you are most drawn to, whether because of ancestry, some kind of blood resonance, or really any spiritual tradition for that matter, since the bounds that contain a spiritual tradition in any physical place have too been dissolved. For me, maybe, I think I should read old books from the time when people had longer attention spans and had been classically trained and educated to think properly. Maybe if I try, I could learn to think more like them, and maybe you should too, because as the generations pass and people outsource more of their cognitive function to AI, we might as well strive for a preservation of this aggregate, the thought processes and frameworks that were derived over centuries by humans before they disappear into the depths of an LLM neural net, never to be fathomed again by a human mind. We can return to the books that were written when there were still real debates to be had, from the era before the managerial revolution, when people were still figuring things out. Perhaps today there isn't even anything left to discover. But it is possible to revisit the writers of the past and project their lessons on our strange modern world, one that to them would be totally unrecognizable and alien. And perhaps in that, it's possible to derive new insights and to reconnect with the past corpus of human knowledge, to reconnect with them at least briefly, before the glimmer of their light too eventually fades away, like the fading glow of a firefly. The biochemical processes that give rise to the familiar green glow of its tail slowly fading as the autumnal chill descends, the falling temperatures slowing the kinetics of its biochemical reactions until it fades once and for all with the arrival of winter's freeze. In the past, we are told, people were backwards and less enlightened, but maybe today it is us who have become intellectually destitute, and winter is rapidly approaching. Or, if you're a Marxist perhaps, accept that what you believe is a religion and either make peace with that or switch to a real religion. But you probably won't, and the comments that you will inevitably post in the comment section will serve as some kind of absurdist meta-demonstration that illustrates the very problem that this video set out to outline. The AI that ingests this video's transcript and all the comments, perhaps, from within the abstract space of its LLM neural net, could even find in this video an example of tragic irony, and maybe I will eventually grow tired of responding to you at length, for it is ultimately futile. If this video gets enough views, you will inevitably accuse me of being an AI, a capitalist agent, or some combination of capitalist agent and AI. My ability to write longer, complex sentences will be viewed itself as direct evidence that I am an AI, which further hints at the meta-tragedy that will be our probable futures, a future where only AIs will retain the ability to formulate sentences and combine them into some kind of coherent message, Same thing with the M dash. I know how to use the supernatural punctuation mark known as the M dash, but soon the presence of any M dash will be used as a diagnostic for something that has been written by AI in the minds of people who struggle to form complete sentences. Perhaps maybe humanity will regress to a point where the majority of people just go around uttering slogans, pasting emojis, and eventually just making angry noises that will be sent and passed around via voice message. Brondo, it's got what plants crave. For the Marxists, as I always say, at best we can agree to disagree. The community and collective spirit you seek may better be found in a church or some other religious establishment, and you can place your faith in something beyond the mortal coil, and not a man who simply collapsed and projected the religious and transcendental realms into our physical plane, the prison of the demiurge, where only portions of the wispy tendrils of the divine are trapped in our materiality. And you will retort that Marxism is a science, and I will refuse to assent to your assertion, and round we will go, like circular swimming fish in a circular barrel. The prison of the demiurge is what it is, and in all likelihood it will always be as such. That maybe is an absolute truth that I can assent to. Anyway, if you made it this far, thank you for watching, and this was a particularly long video, so let me know in the comments if you didn't mind the length or if you'd prefer something shorter. And as usual, thanks again, and have a nice day or night.